Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is another edition of Pop Trivia, and today I'm pleased to have with me entertainment journalist, author, and magazine contributor David McPherson. Welcome to the show, David.
No, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure as well. So, you are quoted in your books as saying that music is the elixir of life. And that's very much my philosophy as well. I always say music is the doctor, and you can see I've got my prescriptions around me here. Editor's note, in the video version of this that you can find on YouTube, you can see my array of musical instruments in my studio. Now, back to the show. So today in Pop Trivia, I'm going to hit you with a topic, person, or a place, and then we'll see what you can tell us about that. So hitting the ground running, why don't we start with Blue Rodeo? What can you tell us about Blue Rodeo?
Yeah, anyone who loves Canadian music and has followed it for the last, 30 plus years, it'd be hard not to know who Blue Rodeo is. Their story has been well documented. They began kind of on the Queen Street West scene in Toronto back in the early mid 1980s. And they're still going strong and been touring, across Canada and filling arenas ever since. But one kind of fun fact that a lot of people might not know about Blue Rodeo is that they also were featured in a Hollywood movie and had their kind of 5 minutes of fame, if you will, on a movie set back in, I think it was the early 1990s when they appeared as the bar band in the movie Postcards from the Edge. And kind of the backstory, how this came about, it was kind of fascinating that the lead actress in that movie ended up, of course, I've kind of have a little forgetful of who it is. I should know.
Was it Meryl Streep?
Meryl Streep. There you go. I knew she was really famous. So Meryl Streep basically was filming another movie in New York, and it happened she was being driven into the city every day, and her driver played a Blue Rodeo record, and she fell in love. And so when it came time to make this new movie, and they were looking for a band, they had all these tapes and everything. And she told the director, I know the perfect band, because she had remembered hearing Blue Rodeo and thought they'd be a good match. And so, Blue Rodeo out of the blue gets this call from Meryl Streep wanting them to do an audition. And so at the old Diamond Club in Toronto, they had this audition for Meryl Streep. And yeah, next thing you know, they were flying out to Hollywood on set as part of this movie.
Very cool. Speaking of old pubs, I know you've written a few books. This one that we're talking about today and pulling things from is 101 Fascinating Facts About Canadian Music. But you've also written a book about the Horseshoe Tavern. So do you have any tales about that spot?
Oh, well, definitely. That was my first book, A Real Labor of Love. I was fortunate to write it kind of at the time with the 70th anniversary of this beloved dive bar, if you will, but it's a beautiful dive bar is what I wrote in my book that has been right at the corner of Queen and Spadina for, now over 75 years. But there's so many tales. I joked back when this book came out in 2017, my publisher had given it the title, The Legendary Horseshoe Tavern, A Complete History. And like and there's no such thing as a complete history. And of course, as soon as I put the final words down and it was published and sent off and people started to read it, I got inundated with lots of emails and texts and things of people saying, oh, did you include this? Or why didn't you include this story? But at the same token, I think through my research, I was able to uncover a lot of pretty fascinating stories about the Horseshoe Tavern. And for those who aren't quite aware of its history, for me, the most interesting part of it is its early history that I really learned about the country artists that played there. Some might know that Stompin' Tom Connors was kind of a regular there, and it became his kind of home away from home when he arrived in Toronto, and he really kept bugging the owner, Jack Starr, that he wanted to play there, and ended up he holds the record that I don't think will ever be beaten for playing the venue like 25 consecutive nights.
Wow.
So that in itself is pretty fascinating. But earlier than that, just even how music came about at the Horseshoe, I think is a really cool story. Basically, Jack Starr He was an entrepreneur more in the textile clothing business. And he surprised his family one day, came home and told them that he bought this tavern. And they were like, what the heck? What's this all about? But I guess he wanted to expand and try something new. And he saw the opportunity. I think, the new liquor licenses were coming in around that time, 1946, 47, when the Horseshoe opened. But originally it was just a drinking hole and a place to go. You could even go and get a prime rib and food. But eventually, because of a lot of the clientele there that were from the East Coast, a lot of people from the Maritimes had kind of headed west and come to Toronto looking for work back then. And one day Jack's walking through the bar and these people say, "Hey, Jack, you should get some music in here." And he goes, "Okay, sure." He always loved to listen to his customers. And he said, "What kind?" And they said, "Country, of course." So he took him up on it. But next thing you know, the Horseshoe Tavern became National North, and like all the big stars from the Grand Ole Opry were rolling into town, like Loretta Lynn and Ernest Tubb and Charlie Pride and Little Jimmy Dickens and Farron Young, like all the names go on and on. It's the Carter family. So to me, that was the biggest surprise. I didn't realize that early history of how the Horseshoe Tavern initially was known as a country bar where all these top stars would play.
That's interesting. I didn't know the history, but I've been to the Horseshoe a few times back in the 80s, and they were either rock bands, rock and roll bands, or pop bands playing there, but it definitely looked like a typical country bar to me. Moving on from the bars for a minute, I understand you also have a story around Santana.
Yeah, Santana, that's one. It's kind of interesting. I was talking to Linda Manzer, who's one of Canada's more well-known luthiers, who is someone who makes and builds guitars. And this is a really cool story she shared with me that early in her career, like her career as an owner, entrepreneur, really hadn't started yet. At the time, she was kind of doing her apprentice and learning the trade, with some other people out in Vancouver, but she was traveling out to see friends. And it just happened that these friends that she was with were living on the property that Santana owned in kind of the Hollywood Hills. I think it was more outside San Francisco. And, she got to hang out there for a while. And Santana, he didn't know necessarily that she was a guitar maker, but her friends did. And after she returned home, basically, she gets this note from her friends saying, "Hey, we'd love you to build this guitar for Santana that we can give it to him for Christmas." And so, how can you turn down that opportunity when you're just trying to start out in, your new career? So yeah, she set about, Linda did all this research, she told me, finding out what Santana was into, some of his hobbies or things that he enjoyed, and tried to incorporate some of that into the guitar. And, basically, long story short, she sent this guitar off and it was apparently well received. And she didn't really know too much until one day she opened up a Guitar Player magazine. And there's a quote from Santana that mentioned, "Oh, I've got this beautiful new guitar that I've been playing that was designed or built for me from Linda Manzer." And so Linda said that basically started her career. One quote or a couple sentences in a magazine, a little serendipity, a little luck, and you never know.
And we'll be right back after this. I was about to say, talk about serendipity, man, being in the right place at the right time and catching such a lucky break. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Sticking with Canadian artists for a minute, what can you tell me about Anne Murray?
Yeah, Anne Murray, I mean, it's when I was doing some events with this new book, The 101 Fascinating Canadian Music Facts, I did a lot of trivia events myself. And one of the trivia questions I included was who's won the most Juno Awards. And that in itself, for those who might think The Weeknd or Drake or Celine Dion, any of these others might have the record, Anne Murray actually still holds the record for most Junos won. And I think a lot of that comes down to just how dominant she was in that early 1970s period, starting with Snowbird, really. And that in itself is the pretty amazing story. For those who don't know, I mean, Snowbird, I remember hearing it as a kid growing up. My parents had the record, and it's been covered like I don't know how many times by how many different artists and so many different genres. But it was number one, and it was a song written by Gene McClelland, who's a famous East Coast songwriter. His daughter, Catherine, is still very active and an award winning songwriter of her own today. But what you were leading at, and what I think I mentioned in my book, the fun fact about Snowbird is one of those examples. There's been quite a few of them over the years, but this one that had such success back in the 1970s, the heyday of vinyl, it was all about singles and the whole idea of a single. We had an A side and a B side, and usually the record company would decide what that lead A side single would be and, send it off to all the radio stations and get them to play it. Well, this is one example where someone flipped over the record. Snowbird was the B side, and it suddenly got played and caught on. So
That song was everywhere. I remember, man.
everywhere.
And
Yeah.
it was. And I'm wearing my Stampeders t-shirt.
Oh,
And it's maybe not such a little secret, but Ronnie King, who's recently passed, and may he rest in peace, was a huge fan
hmm
of Anne Marie. And I remember him posting things on social media about how much Anne liked him more than the other guys. But yeah, she was everywhere, and she's still active in the music business as well. Burton Cummings,
hmm
you have a story or two about him,
Yeah, I mean, Burden, I think that's just another one of those examples where I'm always fascinated at how songs are written and develop, and kind of like that story of Snowbird, how songs kind of either hit or don't hit and have a life of their own, really. And for Burton Cummings, we all know one of the founders of the Guess Who, went on to a great solo career as well, and he's still out there performing. I'm looking forward to hearing him sing in a few weeks as part of the Gordon Lightfoot tribute that they're having at Massey Hall. But going back many, many years, one of my favorite Guess Who songs was No Sugar Tonight, New Mother Nature. And that's one of those interesting, what they call in a way like two songs for the price of one, if you will, right? Where I guess it just happened that he and Randy Bachman would often co-write together, and they'd bring different ideas. And this is one where they each had written this song. Bachman, it was No Sugar Tonight. And for Cummings, it was New Mother Nature. And they felt that it was in similar keys and everything, that they could work together. So they basically brought those songs together. But when I chatted with Burden about the origins of this song, the one amusing thing, I mean, it wasn't so funny, I guess, for him at the time, but it goes back to, again, to the idea of the A side, B side. Initially, because the song would have been too long for radio, they made them an A and a B side, those two songs. And the record company decided that Bachman's, his version, the No Sugar Tonight, would be the A side. And so Bachman said initially he was a little peeved that he didn't get the royalties because that song got a lot more. But he said it ended up all working out in the end. There was another band, I guess, that preferred his version and covered it. And at the end of the day, the two songs together work so well. And it's a staple of Canadian classic rock that I know I wore out listening to back when I first discovered it in high school, that's for sure.
yeah, no kidding. And once again, another act that was everywhere back in the day. Now, going back to, I think it was 1970, the Transcontinental Pop Festival. What can you tell us
hmm
about that?
Well, that one has kind of become more known as Festival Express.
Right.
And it basically was, the concept was, let's have concerts in different places across Canada, and the artists will all travel between the venues on a train. Sounds great in theory, but you can imagine the logistics back in the day, and then also the stories of the debauchery and everything that occurred when you get, I mean, the people involved in this were the band and Janis Joplin and the Dead. There's several others, and it was basically one big party. And of course, in a lot of these cities, there were security issues too, because it was back in the old hippie days where there was a bit of that fight sometimes where the hippies thought they should get everything for free, right? Like you think of Woodstock and how it ended up becoming this free festival. And so there was that same idea. They didn't care that these promoters and these artists needed to make money. I guess it was like, free love, free music. So, there was a few issues where like Toronto with the security, they kind of had to keep them at bay. And I think to appease them, the artists, some of them performed like a separate little show in a nearby park. And then even one of the venues, they were like, they'd seen what was happening. So they decided they didn't want any part of it, one of the cities. So I think it was the Winnipeg or Calgary that at the last minute got filled in as one of the other stops. But yeah, there's a famous story. I mean, there's a great documentary that was made about this you can look up. But the one famous story is about how they stopped en route through the prairies in some small town at the LCBO and basically just bought the place out, because they were out of liquor to continue on the party.
Oh boy. Yeah, and speaking of videos that you can look up, when you mentioned Burton Cummings and Gordon Lightfoot in the same breath, Burton Cummings does a really hilarious impression of Gordon Lightfoot, and I encourage people to look that up on YouTube. Wow, there's some pretty interesting facts there, and I do encourage everybody to go out and pick up a copy of 101 Fascinating Canadian Music Facts. And I understand your books are available on your website, is that right?
More so, I mean, they're available anywhere, but yeah, I mean, your local indie bookseller, Amazon, Indigo, anywhere you can buy a book, basically. I always say support your local bookstore if you have one, and then from there you can go to Indigo or Amazon and find it for sure.
Very cool. Yeah, you mentioned back in the day in the 1970, 71 that people wanted music for free. Wow. Imagine that, music for
Yeah.
free.
Yeah.
Nothing changes, but everything changes. Well, listen, David, I don't want to take up your whole day. I know that you've got more writing to do. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this with me. And until next time, cheers. Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including recording, editing, guest acquisition, etc. And hey, here's some news. We've just recently joined forces with 519 Magazine, so you can check out my interviews there as well. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn, all rights reserved. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help us keep it going, why don't you click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that stuff. We really appreciate it. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, cheers.